Before we begin, I need you to answer something in the comments right now. Have you ever watched someone humiliate a person who could not fight back in that moment and felt, watching it, the absolute certainty that what just happened was going to cost the person who did it everything? Drop your answer below. I will read every single one. Because this story starts with a slap. One slap. In a hospital corridor at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday in October. 41 people saw it happen. Roland Voss did not know any of their names. He did not know the name of the nurse he slapped. He did not know she was 7 months pregnant. He did not know she had been standing in that corridor for 6 hours without a break covering a colleague who had called in sick, and that the medication error he was screaming about had been made by a physician 3 levels above her in the hospital hierarchy, and that she had been explaining this with the composed, professional clarity of someone who had been a nurse for 8 years and who had never once lost her dignity in a hospital corridor. He did not know any of that. He knew she was in his way. He knew she was speaking when he wanted her to stop speaking. And he knew, or believed, with the specific, unchallenged certainty of a man who had never been made to account for anything in 44 years of building a real estate empire on the backs of people whose names he did not know, that there would be no consequence. He was wrong about that, because the one thing Roland Voss did not know, the one piece of information that would have changed everything about that Wednesday afternoon if he had possessed it, was the name of Zola Carter's brother. Some mistakes announced themselves. They arrive loudly. The slammed door, the raised voice, the public declaration of something that cannot be taken back. They produce immediate consequences that the person making the mistake can see coming and choose to make or not make. Some mistakes are quiet. They happen in the specific, comfortable silence of someone who has always been powerful enough that consequences were something other people experienced. They happen without warning or hesitation because the person making them has spent 44 years in a world that did not produce warnings. Roland Voss made a quiet mistake. In a hospital corridor, in front of 41 witnesses. And the consequence did not arrive loudly either. It arrived the way Jean Carter arrived everywhere. Quietly, precisely, and with the specific, unhurried quality of someone who understood that the most powerful statement was not the one that was made the loudest. Right, he had no idea. In the comments if this story finds you today. Now, let us begin. Zola Carter was 31 years old and had been a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Atlanta for 8 years. Which meant she had been a nurse since she was 23. Which meant she had started her career while most of her college classmates were still deciding what their careers were going to be. She had always known. Atlanta-raised. The daughter of Raymond and Gloria Carter. Raymond, a retired postal worker, Gloria, a school cafeteria manager. Both of them people who had built their lives on the specific, practical wisdom of showing up correctly every single day regardless of whether anyone was watching or rewarding the showing up. Zola had absorbed this completely. She worked the cardiac unit at Mercy General with the focused, warm precision of someone who understood that what she was doing. The monitoring, the assessment, the specific, trained attention to the signals a body sent before it stopped being able to send them, was not a job in the ordinary sense. It was the specific work of sitting with people at the most vulnerable moments of their lives and making those moments as safe and as dignified as she could make them. She was extraordinary at it. Her colleagues knew it. Her patients knew it. The ones who were conscious, the ones who remembered, the ones who sent cards to the unit at Christmas with her name written at the top. Her supervisors knew it in the specific, practical way of people who know which nurses they can trust with the difficult rooms and which nurses they schedule accordingly. 7 months pregnant. The pregnancy had reorganized everything in the best possible way. The specific, full-bodied joy of a woman who had planned for this and was experiencing it as exactly the thing she had planned for. The father was a man named David who was good and present and who had painted the nursery twice because the first color had not been right and who had not complained about painting it twice. She had been on her feet for 6 hours on the Wednesday Roland Voss arrived at Mercy General. Not because anyone had asked her to be. Because her colleague Priya had called in sick at 7 in the morning and the unit was short and Zola Carter did not leave a short unit short if she could help it. 6 hours. 7 months pregnant. Standing in a cardiac unit corridor managing 4 patients and a medication discrepancy that had been created by a physician who had left the building 2 hours earlier. That was where Roland Voss found her. Roland Voss was 44 years old and had built Voss Development Group into one of the largest private real estate development companies in the Southeast. Not through vision exactly, though he would have said vision if asked, but through the specific, grinding combination of inherited capital and the particular willingness to do things that people with more conscience found difficult to do. He had displaced 400 families from a Vine City neighborhood for a mixed-use development that had been on the cover of 3 architecture publications and had produced returns that had made his investors very happy. He had done this without losing a night of sleep. He was at Mercy General on Wednesday afternoon because his mother, Eleanor Voss, 71, sharp and difficult, and the one person in Roland's life who had ever made him feel accountable, had been admitted the previous night with chest pains, and he had arrived to find her sedated and her medication schedule not where he believed it should be. He had found Zola Carter in the corridor. He had asked about the medication. She had explained, calmly, professionally, with the specific warm clarity of someone who understood that family members of patients were frightened and that frightened people sometimes needed to be told the same thing twice before it landed. He had not wanted the explanation. He had wanted compliance. When she had continued explaining rather than simply agreeing to do what he was demanding, which was to change a medication protocol that a physician had ordered and that she did not have the authority to change unilaterally, and that she was not going to change unilaterally because changing it would have been medically incorrect, he had raised his voice. She had not raised hers. He had stepped toward her. She had not stepped back. And then, in front of 41 people in a cardiac unit corridor at 2:17 in the afternoon, Roland Voss had raised his hand and slapped Zola Carter across her face. The corridor went silent. Not the gradual, spreading silence of a room processing something. The immediate, collective silence of 41 people who had just watched something happen that none of them had expected and all of them would remember. Zola's hand went to her face. Her expression did not collapse. It did not perform shock or devastation or the specific, visible distress that Roland Voss had perhaps expected to produce. It went to the specific, settling quality of someone who has just received something and is deciding with absolute clarity what comes next. What came next was Dr. Adiz Okafor. Dr. Adiz Okafor was the chief of medicine at Mercy General Hospital. She had been in her office on the 3rd floor when the call came from the charge nurse on the cardiac unit. She had walked from the 3rd floor to the cardiac unit corridor in approximately 90 seconds, which was approximately how long it took her to understand from the call what had happened and to decide what her face was going to look like when she arrived. Her face, when she arrived, was the specific, composed face of a woman who had been running a hospital for 11 years and who understood that the next 60 seconds were going to define how this institution responded to what had just happened in its corridor. Roland Voss was still in the corridor. He was speaking to someone on his phone with the specific, managed energy of a man who had done something and was already moving to the next agenda item. His attorney Marcus Webb, who had arrived with him that afternoon, stood slightly behind him with the expression of a man who had been managing situations like this for 30 years and was already calculating. Zola Carter was still standing where she had been standing. Her hand was no longer at her face. Her posture had not changed. She was looking at the wall across the corridor with the specific, interior expression of someone who is processing something privately and completely and who has not yet decided what to say to the 41 people who are watching her. Dr. Okafor assessed the room in 3 seconds. Then she did something that Marcus Webb had not anticipated, and that would be discussed in the hospital for a long time afterward. She walked to Zola first, not to Roland. Not to the man whose family had donated 2 wings to this hospital and whose mother was currently in a room on this floor. To Zola. She placed her hand on Zola's arm. She said quietly, "You are done for today? Go home. This is handled." Then she turned to Roland Voss. What happened next was the specific, organized reckoning of a woman who had 11 years of institutional authority behind every word she said and who deployed it with the focused, precise energy of someone who understood that this moment was being watched by 41 people and that 41 people were going to carry what happened here out of this corridor and into the world. She told him what he had done. She told him that he had struck a member of her medical staff. A pregnant member of her medical staff in a hospital corridor. She told him that he had committed assault. She told him that the hospital's security footage would reflect exactly what had occurred at 2:17 this afternoon, and that it would be provided to Atlanta Police Department within the hour. Roland said his attorney would be in touch. Dr. Okafor said she had no doubt. She asked security to escort him from the building. He left. 20 minutes later, Marcus Webb called the hospital administrator and said that Mr. Voss was prepared to settle the matter privately and that there was no need for police involvement, and that the Voss family had been significant supporters of Mercy General for many years. The hospital administrator said he would need to speak with Dr. Okafor. Dr. Okafor said there would be no private settlement and that the police report had already been filed. Then Marcus Webb made the call that changed the shape of what followed. He called the hospital board, and the hospital board, which contained two members who had significant financial relationships with Voss Development Group, called Dr. Okafor and said that they were concerned about the optics of a public confrontation with a major donor family and that perhaps a quiet resolution was in everyone's interest. Dr. Okafor said she understood their concern. What happened next was the part that nobody at the board level had anticipated. Zola Carter was suspended pending investigation. Not Roland Voss. Zola Carter. The suspension was communicated to her by a hospital administrator at 4:30 that afternoon. The specific, organized cowardice of an institution choosing money over the person who had been struck in its corridor. She received it with the same composed expression she had worn since 2017. She thanked the administrator. She collected her things. She went home. She called her brother. I need you in the comments right now. Roland Voss slapped a pregnant nurse in a hospital corridor and walked out while she got suspended. Tell me what you would have done in that corridor. And tell me, do you think he understood yet what he had set in motion? Drop your answer below. Gene Carter was 37 years old. He had been adopted into the Carter family at age 4. Raymond and Gloria Carter had fostered him first, then formally adopted him when his biological parents' parental rights were terminated, and he had grown up in the same Atlanta house as Zola with the same school lunches and the same Sunday dinners and the same specific, practical wisdom of two people who showed up correctly every single day. He had also, across the years since he left that house, built something that Raymond and Gloria Carter knew about in the general, careful way of parents who understood their child and had made their peace with the specific path he had chosen. Gene Carter was the head of the Chongsan Network. This was not a name that appeared in newspapers. It was not a name that appeared in federal indictments, though it had been spoken in federal buildings in the specific, careful register of people who understood that they were dealing with something organized and precise enough that proving it in a courtroom had been, thus far, a project that had not produced results. The Chongsan Network controlled the movement of significant portions of the cash economy across 6 southeastern states. Not drugs. Gene had made that decision at 24 and had never revisited it. The specific, quiet brutality of what he had watched drugs do to the neighborhoods he had grown up adjacent to had produced in him a line that he did not cross and did not permit to be crossed within his organization. What the network controlled was everything else. Protection, information, the specific, invisible infrastructure that legitimate businesses required and did not ask too many questions about. The specific understanding that certain problems could be resolved through channels that did not involve attorneys or court filings or the public record. He was not a violent man. That was the thing about Gene Carter that the people who had underestimated him had discovered too late. He was not violent in the specific, performed way of people who needed violence to communicate power. He was precise. He was patient. He understood that the most effective communication of power was not the demonstration of what you could do. It was the demonstration that you already had. He had been in Seoul on business when Zola called. He answered on the first ring because he always answered Zola on the first ring. She told him what had happened. Not dramatically. Zola Carter did not do dramatic. She told him factually. The corridor. 217. The slap. The 41 witnesses. The suspension. Gene was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he was coming home. She said he did not need to come home for this. He said he was coming home. She said, Gene, I am okay. He said, I know you are. That is not why I am coming home. He ended the call. He booked the first available flight from Seoul to Atlanta. He arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson at 11:17 the following morning. He did not go to the hospital. He went to the office. Gene Carter's Atlanta office was in a building in Buckhead that appeared, on all available public records, to belong to a logistics consulting firm called Meridian Advisory Partners. The office itself was clean and organized and entirely unremarkable, the kind of space that communicated nothing except competence and discretion. His second-in-command, a man named Thomas who had been with him for 9 years, had already assembled everything Gene needed by the time he arrived. Everything about Roland Voss. Not the publicly available information. Anyone could find that. The specific information that moved through channels that required the kind of access that took years and relationships to build. Roland Voss had made 41 enemies in 44 years of building his empire. Gene did not need 41. He needed 3. 3 specific people in Roland Voss's world who had specific, documented reasons to want specific outcomes. Outcomes that Gene Carter's network could facilitate if the terms were correct. Thomas laid out the options. Gene looked at them for a long time. Then he said, "None of these." "Not yet." Thomas looked at him. Gene said, "I want to meet him first." Thomas said, "Why?" Gene said, "Because I want him to understand what happened before he understands what is happening." He said it the way he said things that were already decided. Quietly, without emphasis, with the specific certainty of someone who did not need anyone in the room to agree with him. Thomas nodded. The meeting was arranged for the following Thursday. Not through threats. Through channels that Roland Voss would not have recognized as anything other than a routine business inquiry. A potential investment opportunity in a Voss development project, routed through an intermediary firm that had the specific appearance of the kind of capital that Roland Voss spent his professional life cultivating. Roland Voss's office confirmed the meeting within 4 hours. Of course they did. Gene Carter arrived at the Voss Development Group offices on the 32nd floor of a Midtown Atlanta building at exactly 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. He was alone. No attorney. No associate. No visible security. He wore a dark suit that communicated money without announcing it. The specific, understated quality of someone who did not need clothing to communicate what he was. Roland Voss's assistant showed him in. Roland was behind his desk. He was the specific kind of man who used his desk as an instrument of power, the size of it, the height of his chair, the specific arrangement that communicated who was on which side of it. He had the warm, practiced handshake of someone who had spent 44 years in rooms like this, and who had calibrated the handshake to communicate just enough warmth to make the other person comfortable and not enough to suggest equality. He offered Gene a seat. Gene sat. Roland said he had reviewed the materials from Meridian Advisory and was interested in learning more about what kind of capital they were looking to deploy. Gene said he would get to that. Roland said, "Of course." Gene said, "I want to talk about something else first." Roland said, "Of course." Gene said, "I want to talk about Wednesday afternoon at Mercy General Hospital." Roland's expression did not change. That was the tell. A man who had nothing to manage would have shown confusion. A man whose expression did not change at the mention of a hospital he had not been asked about in a business meeting was a man who was already managing. Gene watched the management happen. Roland said he was not sure what Mercy General had to do with their conversation. Gene said, "The nurse in the cardiac unit corridor. At 2:17. In front of 41 people." Roland said that situation was being handled by his legal team and that he preferred to keep business conversations and personal matters separate. Gene said, "I understand. That is a reasonable preference. I am going to ask you to set it aside for this conversation." He said it with the same quiet, unhurried tone he used for everything. No threat in the voice. No edge. Simply the specific, settled certainty of someone who is accustomed to being the most important person in the room and who does not need to perform that certainty because it is simply true. Roland looked at him. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. The specific, quiet shift of a man who has been in enough rooms with enough people to understand that the person across from him is not the person the meeting materials said he was going to be. Gene said, "The nurse's name is Zola Carter." Roland said nothing. Gene said, "She is 7 months pregnant. She had been working for 6 hours without a break covering a colleague who was sick. The medication issue you were angry about was created by a physician 2 levels above her who had left the building 2 hours before you arrived. She was explaining this to you clearly and professionally, and you struck her." Still Roland said nothing. Gene said, "I want to make sure you have the full picture of what happened before we continue." Roland said, "Who are you?" Gene said, "I am Zola Carter's brother." The room was very quiet. Roland's eyes moved briefly to the door and then back to Gene. The door was closed. The assistant was outside. Everything was completely ordinary and completely still. Jean said, I want to be clear about something. I am not here to threaten you. I am not here to make demands. I am here because Zola would not want me to do what I am capable of doing, and I respect her more than I have ever respected anything in my life. So before I decide what happens next, I wanted to sit in a room with you and see what kind of man you are in private. Roland said, I do not know what you think you know about me. Jean said, I know everything about you. Not the public version. The actual version. The 41 things, and the 400 families, and the 3 board members, and the 2 investors, and the specific conversation you had with Marcus Webb on Wednesday afternoon about making this quiet. Roland's hands on the desk were still. Jean said, I know these things not because I looked them up. I know them because the kind of work I do requires knowing things about people before situations require me to know them. You have been in my file for 3 years, Mr. Voss. Not because you were a priority. Because Atlanta is my city, and people who operate the way you operate tend to become relevant eventually. He said it without satisfaction, simply as information. Roland said, What do you want? Jean said, I want Zola reinstated. Full back pay. A formal public apology from you personally delivered to the hospital in front of the staff who witnessed Wednesday. The board members who pressured the suspension removed from the Mercy General Board. And a donation to the hospital's nursing staff wellness fund in an amount that reflects the seriousness of what you did. He paused. He said, Those are Zola's terms. She gave them to me last night. I told her I would deliver them. Roland said, And if I do not? Jean looked at him for a long, quiet moment. He said, Then the 41 witnesses give their statements. The security footage goes to the DA's office instead of the Attorney General's office where it currently sits because I asked them to hold it. The 3 board members discover that their financial relationships with you have become visible in ways that are inconvenient. And the 41 things become 42. He said it with the same tone he had used for everything else in the room. Not louder, not harder, simply the information. Roland Voss sat behind his large desk in his large office on the 32nd floor of a Midtown Atlanta building and understood, for the first time in 44 years, what it felt like to be on the wrong side of something he could not buy his way out of. The reinstatement came on Monday. Not the quiet, administrative reinstatement of a letter from HR. The public reinstatement. Roland Voss, standing in the lobby of Mercy General Hospital in front of 107 staff members, hospital board members, and Dr. Adiz Okafor, delivering an apology that his attorney had written and that Jean had reviewed and returned with 17 corrections, each one making the language more specific and more accountable. He delivered it. His voice held. Whether or not it cost him something was information that only he possessed. Zola stood in the first row in her nursing uniform, 7 months pregnant. Her expression during the apology was the specific, composed expression she had worn since 2:17 on Wednesday. Not satisfaction, not performance, simply the warm, clear-eyed presence of someone who was receiving what was owed and who had always known it would arrive. After the apology, Roland Voss left the building without speaking to anyone. His attorney spoke briefly with the hospital administrator about the logistics of the donation. Dr. Okafor shook Zola's hand. She said, I should have done more on Wednesday. Zola said, You did what you could. Dr. Okafor said, I should have done more. Zola received this. Then she said, Yes. But you are doing it now. Dr. Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she said, How did this happen? The reinstatement. The apology. All of it. Zola said, My brother came home. Dr. Okafor said, Who is your brother? Zola said, Someone who loves me very much. She left it there. Jean had not attended the apology. Not because he did not want to. Because Zola had asked him not to, and because Gene Carter did not put himself in rooms where his presence would tell a story that was not the right story for that room. The story of that room was Zola's. He had watched it on the security feed from Thomas's phone in the Meridian Advisory office. When it was over, Thomas had put the phone down. Gene had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, She is the strongest person I have ever known. Thomas had said, She got it from somewhere. Gene had looked at him. Thomas had said, Your parents, Raymond and Gloria, they raised you both. Gene had been quiet. Then he had said, Yes, they did. He had picked up his phone. He had called Zola. She had answered on the second ring. He had said, How do you feel? She had said, Tired. Good. ready to go back to work. He had said, "The nursery color. Has David finished repainting?" She had said, "He finished last week. It is the right color now." He had said, "Good." She had said, "Jean." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Thank you for coming home." He had said, "Where else would I be?" She said, "You did not have to do it this way. You could have done it the other way." He said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you would have had to live with the other way. And you are going to be someone's mother in 8 weeks. And I want the person that child knows to be the person you have always been, not the person who carries what the other way would have required." The line was quiet. She said, "I love you." He said, "I know. Come home for Sunday dinner. Mom is making the thing you like." She said she would be there. He ended the call. He sat in the Meridian Advisory office for a long time. Roland Voss had a difficult 18 months ahead of him. Not because Jean Carter had arranged it, not exactly, but because 41 witnesses had given their statements to Atlanta PD and the DA's office had decided the evidence was sufficient, and because 3 board members were navigating their own difficulties, and because the 41 things had a way of becoming public when the person who knew about them decided visibility was more useful than silence. Jean Carter had not arranged any of it. He had simply stopped preventing it. Roland Voss slapped a pregnant black nurse in a hospital corridor at 2:17 on a Wednesday afternoon. He did it in front of 41 people. He did it because he had spent 44 years in a world that did not produce consequences for men like him. He did not know her name. He did not know she had been on her feet for 6 hours. He did not know she was 7 months pregnant with a child who would arrive 8 weeks later and who would be named Isaiah, and who would grow up hearing the story of his mother standing in a corridor with her hand on her face and not collapsing. And he did not know her brother. He did not know that Jean Carter had been raised in the same house, by the same people, eating the same Sunday dinners, learning the same specific, practical wisdom of showing up correctly every single day. He did not know that when Jean Carter came home, it was not with rage. It was with patience and precision and the quiet, devastating understanding of a man who had spent 20 years building something that a man like Roland Voss could not buy, bribe, or threaten his way out of. Zola Carter went back to work on Monday morning. 7 months pregnant. 8 years of perfect patient care. The same warm, precise, composed presence she had brought to every shift of her entire career. She stood in the cardiac unit corridor at the start of her shift and looked at the place where it had happened. Then she looked away. She had 4 patients to see. She went to see them. Final question for you. Have you ever watched someone underestimate a person so completely and known, before the story was finished, that the underestimation was going to cost them everything? Leave your answer below. Every voice belongs in this conversation. Share this with someone who needs to see it today. Like if this found something true in you. Subscribe. Hit the bell. I love you all. I will see you in the next story.